We're in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. So let's begin with verse 1. Now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. The king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. Now, based on historical study, this is around 603, 602 BC. It's good that we can have kind of an accurate, pretty accurate idea about that. And I believe this was more than just your normal dream. I think his heart was troubled about it. He knew that something, I think God's Spirit had worked in him so that he knew that something, this dream was something special. And so he called in the different people that, would claim to be able to interpret the dreams. And I think the fact of what we're going to see him doing indicates he had some distrust of them. And we could get into a discussion of some of the words here for the sorcerers and conjurers, but if you'd like, we'll just go on ahead and move past that. But I think the fact he didn't tell his dream to his advisors. Now, if you have the King James Version, it kind of suggests that he forgot it. But this is not a textual issue, it's a translation issue. And it's really more like he told them, the word has gone out. You need to tell me what this dream is before you interpret it. And so it's just a matter of what the translation should be there. And if you have a question or comment as we go through this, I'm chuckling because there's a lot of fakery in religion, a lot of it, even in Christian denominations or churches. I want to read to you a story from W.A. Criswell. He said, I had a friend who was a seminary student, and he attended a service where they spoke in unknown languages, unknown tongues. And they were speaking in unknown language. And so he stood up and he quoted the first psalm in Hebrew. He'd been studying Hebrew, so he quoted the first psalm in Hebrew. And then he sat back down. And they asked if there was an interpreter present. An interpreter got up and he said, this is what this gentleman has told us in an unknown language. He said, he's telling us how a woman ought to dress when she comes to church and how she ought to do and comb her hair in order to be in public. He laughed. The student laughed. He said, no, I just quoted from Psalm 1 in Hebrew. I memorized it and quoted it, and they threw him out of the church. Now, there's, of course, differing reasons why people will do this type of thing. I trust we've already talked about the preacher named Peter Popoff, and he is famous, at least in some circles, for what he was doing as a charlatan. And just to remind you real quickly, I mean, we could spend quite a bit of time on this. He would call out for someone's name in this huge, vast building, and he would name them. He would tell them, God told me what your disease is. Come up and I will heal you. God will heal you. And so they would come up, and turns out his wife was meeting people at the door, and they had he was wearing what looked like hearing aids. You'd think if he's a faith healer, why did he need those? Well, he needed it so he could get the messages from his wife. and and this guy set out to figure out how he was doing this. He was a skeptic. So he had someone to help him, and they figured out what frequency he was using, and they copied his wife talking to him on this frequency. And she would tell them the name of the people as they came through the door, and so forth, and what their disease was based on what the person told them. And then the skeptic recorded this information and went on the Johnny Carson show many years ago and played it. And that's when it was discovered what this guy was doing. So he was making millions of dollars, but he went into bankruptcy. But if you go online and look for the name of Peter Popoff, you'll see he's still, he's back in business now. Yeah. So there's a lot of fakery in religion, and that's what these people were. And I think Nebuchadnezzar knew it. And that's why he wanted them to tell what was the dream before you tell me the interpretation of it. Okay, so beginning in chapter 2, verse 4, there's a transition. I don't know if you're aware of this, but actually the Hebrew Bible, when we speak of the Hebrew Bible, we're speaking of a Bible that's not just written in Hebrew. There's numerous chapters in the Hebrew Bible that are written in Aramaic. Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew, but there's about, beginning in chapter 2, verse 4, there's a transition from Hebrew into Aramaic. And that goes on until about chapter 7. And so someone might wonder, well, why is there this change that takes place? Is there two different authors? The answer is no. No, there's not two different authors. But the king was not speaking to Daniel in Hebrew. It's more likely he was speaking in Aramaic. Aramaic was kind of the language of the day that people used in commerce, and so I think they could have spoken in more than one language, but the king would not have been speaking in Hebrew. He would have been speaking in Aramaic or another language, and I think he spoke in Aramaic, and that's why Daniel recorded this in Aramaic, so people would know not just Hebrews, but, and by the way, the Hebrews, when they moved into Babylon, the Jewish people, they began to speak in Aramaic because that was the language. I mean, it's like people coming to this country. They're going to learn English, most likely. And so they would still use Hebrew in the synagogue, but they also learned Aramaic. And so when they went back to Israel, they spoke in Aramaic. And they still used Hebrew in the synagogue. And of course, they also had to learn Greek when the Greeks took over the empire. And the name Aram, I don't know if you recall this from the list of the sons of Noah. Noah had a son named Shem. And the word Semites comes from his name. And Shem had a son. This is all in Genesis chapter 10, I believe. And so in Genesis chapter 10, you'll see that Aram, and I can give you the verses if you want to know them. Aram was the son of Shem. And that's where we get the Aramean language, the Aramaic language. So, questions, comments before we move on? Okay, so let's pick up at chapter 2, verse 4. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation." The king replied to the Chaldeans, "The command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and reward and great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation." Now, when the Chaldeans said live forever, this was a customary salutation. They did not mean they believed that the king would live forever. It's kind of like when they're in the kingdoms of the past, someone might say, long live the king. They wished the king a long life. He did not wish that for them. If they could not answer this question, what is the dream I had? Now, by the way, if he had forgotten the dream, they could have made up some dream and said, no, we discovered what your dream is, here it is, and interpret it for you. They didn't do that. I think they realized he knew what the dream was, and he was not going to tell them. And so unless there's a comment or question, we'll go on to verse 7.
So the King James people, in verse 5, they said, the king said, the thing is gone from me.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and that's just a question of what the word there in the Aramaic meant. And the King James translators, that was about 400 years ago. Or was it a little longer than that now?
16.
Yeah, it was quite a while back, 500 years ago. And so more archaeological discoveries, manuscripts, ancient languages have been found, and it's thought that the king is not saying that he's forgotten it. So, I appreciate you asking the question. Another question, comment? Okay, let's go on to verse 7. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare the interpretation. The king replied, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen the command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation. So these wise men, astrologers, conjurers, so forth, they were powerless. None of their tricks could help them figure out what the dream was. And their only hope was, that the king might change his mind, but he wasn't going to change his mind. Now, by the way, some people think that Satan can read our minds. I don't believe he can. If he could read our minds, he probably would have read Nebuchadnezzar's mind and told these guys what the dream was. But he didn't do that. I don't think he could. Now, you may say, well, he's awful effective in tempting people. Well, I think that's partly because, he's been around a long time, and he knows humans pretty well, and he knows what kind of things we'll fall for. But I don't think Satan can read minds. This is part of the reason why, this passage right here. Okay. Question or comment before we go on to verse 10? Okay, verse 10. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who declared the matter for the king, insomuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. So these conjurers claim to be able to discern the will of the gods. So if they could really speak to the gods and determine what the gods wanted, why couldn't they tell the king what he wanted to know? God has set the stage so that there will be a resounding affirmation that when Daniel shares the dream and the interpretation, they will know that it's the true God who's given him this information. So, now by the way, it says in verse 12, the king says his wise men were liars, deserved the penalty he had announced. He issued a warrant for the arrest. I think it says that of all the wise men. I think that's in verse 12. So,
Why do you think it's different in this than it was in like Joseph's situation?
well, Joseph could tell what the dream was. He could interpret the dream, but he did not have to tell what the dream was. And this was different. No one that we haven't noticed of in Scripture that I know of had to tell what someone else's dream was.
Yeah. But there was an assumption then that they could, and they promoted that they could correctly. So they either had a leak, from some of the king's, if the king had told anyone, there are no secrets if one person, knows.
Well, apparently he had not told anyone what the dream was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly,
So,
which is the only way they couldn't know, but the practice, they promoted that they could until he confronted them.
they said they could interpret dreams, but they didn't claim, that they could.
To reveal it.
Yeah. So, but I think he knew that basically these people were charlatans, tricksters. And that's what magicians are today. I mean, it's, for the most part.
Guard Maddie here this morning with that.
What's,
Maddie, when
oh,
man said,
magicians aren't real.
yeah, they don't know how to do magic. She went, like, what? Didn't she? Yeah, that was, that got her.
Yeah, I had meant to bring a deck of cards and do a little trick with them, and I forgot to bring them. It's probably just as well, but I don't want to be doing magic in the church. But then I was going to show her how I did my trick, so maybe another time I'll do that. But yeah, but that's a good point. They claim to be able to know things, and now they don't. Now, by the way, I'm not denying that there may be unusual cases where demonic presence is involved with someone, and the demons don't know what the future is, but they may know something else about someone else, some family member, and they might be able to share that. So in other words, there are, I believe, demonic possession of people. I don't know how much we see it in this country. I've seen some videos of people I thought were possessed, and but anyway, so Daniel comes to him, unless there's a comment or question. Verse 14. Then Daniel replied with discretion. Well, let's go to verse 12 first. Because of this, this was what I meant to read, I'm sorry. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Now, Daniel wasn't present, but they're going to kill all the wise men. But it seems kind of unfair, Are students expected to know more than their teachers? But Daniel replied in verse 14 with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of, captain of the guard. Yeah, pardon me. Had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" And Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. So Daniel knew beyond doubt in this deadly emergency he was to trust himself to the faithfulness of God. Never before, as mentioned earlier, never before had an interpreter of a dream been required to tell what the dream was. But that's what is required here. And the pagan wise men said only a God, only deity could confirm what this dream was. So they're setting up the situation where Daniel is going to reveal the dream and its interpretation, and it will be clearly known that it was his God who revealed it to him. So, picking up at verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, so they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. You know, if you're facing a major decision in life, it's not a bad idea to get some people to pray for you. And that's what he did here. So that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Now, it's ironic, Daniel ends up saving the lives of all these magicians. But later on, it is probably some of these same magicians who seek to set him up to kill him, to have him killed. Okay, let's pick up at verse 19. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever. For wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." So it says here that God is the one who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. Is anyone getting too warm? We can turn on the air conditioning if you are. Everyone's okay? All right. So does this mean that God has control over everything? Yes. However, you also have a free choice, don't you? So he is the final authority, and yet he allows us to make free choices. Christians disagree to some extent on the answer to this question, and we'll not spend a lot of time on it. I'll just tell you my understanding. I believe that God has made us so that we have a free will. And we can choose. He wanted to make us with a free will so we could choose to love him. He loves us. He could have made us without a free will. That's kind of like being a robot. But he didn't do that. He made us so that we could choose to love him or to reject him. And he holds us accountable for that choice. Yet he knows everything, and he knows what's going to happen. He knows what we're going to choose. So we could spend a lot of time on that question. But God is in control, and yet things happen in this world that are not what he desires. Okay, that's some of my thinking. So, question or comment before we move on? Let's go to verse 26. The king said to Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I've seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while in your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than in any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. So Daniel is clearly indicating it's not his personal ability. It's not that he's so wise. He is trusting in the true God. The true God has revealed to him this mystery and the dream. Okay, before we move on to verse 21, a question, comment? Okay, verse 21. We're getting to the good part here. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on the feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Okay, so I gave a little, for some of you who were here one time, I gave a little homework on this for this session. Does anyone want to tell us from your study, when did the stone hit the statue? Was it in the first coming of Christ, or is it still to happen in the second coming? Anyone did some study on this or some thoughts they want to share?
Maybe see what MacArthur said.
I thought you would have seen what MacArthur said, you know. I think I know what he says, but I haven't read it. Okay, so anyone want to share some thoughts on this before we move forward? Okay, so the first kingdom is Babylon. Now, before I begin here, I'll just tell you, there's some who believe that someone in the 2nd century wrote this, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, wrote this, and all of the book of Daniel was basically fulfilled in the 2nd century with Antiochus, one of the kings, who set up an idol of Zeus in the temple, and he offered swine on the altar, and for 3.5 years, the godly Israelites were infuriated, and they had a revolt. The Maccabee brothers led in this revolt, and God granted them victory. I believe there is some of the book of Daniel that refers to Antiochus, but the reason this was a popular view for many scholars was they wanted to deny that revelation could occur. So whoever wrote this must have written it after it occurred. So that's the view that, you know, all of this was fulfilled in the 2nd century BC, and the Greek Empire, and the Empire of Antiochus is the last one. So you would have the Babylonian Empire, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks. And of course the Medes and the Persians were really together in one empire. So they would say, you know, and the author who wrote this really didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know his history. So they're assuming that he made a mistake when they're the ones making a mistake when denying divine revelation. Okay, so those who believe the scriptures are in pretty much agreement. The first kingdom is the kingdom of Babylon. And then about 539, 540 BC, the Persians, Persians and the Medes joined together, and they defeated the Babylonian Empire. So from 539 to about 331 BC, you have the Medo-Persian Empire. Now it's interesting, as you think about the metals here, gold is at the top. Nebuchadnezzar had absolute authority in his kingdom. The Medes and Persians, the king of the Persian Empire had less authority than Nebuchadnezzar. And so if he made a law, he couldn't just revoke the law. He had to kind of change it up a little bit. And this happened when in the book of Esther, those who hated the Jews could go out and try to kill them, and then he granted the Jews authority to defend themselves. So the metals become less valuable in this statute, but they become stronger. So the bronze, as I understand it, is a mixture of copper and tin. And of course, a lot of soldiers used bronze implements. Their shields and so forth were made of bronze. And so the third kingdom is the kingdom of Greece. And Alexander did something quite remarkable. Within the space of 3 years, he conquered the Persian Empire, and he made the largest ancient empire of the ancient world, the largest one. He even went into India and defeated Indian soldiers there. So, but he died at the age of 33, and the kingdom fell into 4 generals then took over the kingdom. And then finally we have in chapter 2, verse 40, the fourth kingdom. And this is, it would be Rome, 146 BC, some would say is when we could date this. That's when the defeat of Carthage took place. And then the question becomes, when did the Roman Empire end? Or has it ended? You say, oh, certainly it's ended. Well, some would say, yeah, it's ended, but then it's going to be reborn again in the future. Some of the dispensational writers say this. And this is one of the more difficult questions, and biblical scholars who believe in the authority of Scripture come to differing conclusions about this. And I want to share with you some of the reasons why. Some have suggested, by the way, that the 2 legs of the statue represented the Eastern and Western Roman Empire when they divided about 395, AD 395. You had the Western and the Eastern portions of the empire, the Roman Empire, divided, and you had 2 empires. Others would say, no, the reason the statue had 2 legs is because humans have 2 legs, and that's why the statue had 2 legs. It doesn't represent that. And then you have the 10 toes of the statue. And the same question could be raised about the 10 toes. Did the statue have 10 toes because it represented 10 kings in the future? Or did the statue have 10 toes because most humans have 10 toes? So this is where it becomes somewhat difficult to determine what the statue, when we see the final fulfillment of this prophecy. Before I go on, though, I want to share something I thought was interesting. with you. This is a quotation that was, in other words, some would say we are still in the Roman Empire. You may say, well, no, the Roman Empire stopped a long time ago. However, we still have much of the same type of government that the Roman Empire had. You had a Senate. You had an emperor. We call him president in our country. They can make executive orders. And then in the word Kaiser, that was for a long time in Germany, you would have a Kaiser, I believe, and that was their translation of the word Caesar. A Tsar of Russia, that's the Russian word for Caesar. And then you had the Holy Roman Empire later on in history, which was not holy or Roman, you could argue, but it's, so in other words, some would say we still are in the period of the Roman Empire. And some would say even that it's not, the Bible never speaks about the Roman Empire. It never uses those words. Now it speaks about it, but not using those words. So they would say, those who take this view, that the Fourth Empire is symbolic of the Western nations. I don't know if you've ever heard the name Ray Stedman. He was a proponent of this view. So, but I just thought this was interesting. Someone wrote this in a book called Why Democracies Fail. And the writer said, democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse out of the public treasure. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidate promising the most benefit from the public treasury, with the result that democracy always collapses over a loose fiscal policy, always to be followed by a dictatorship and then a monarchy. You may say, what if that was that just written last year? No. It sounds like it, but no. This was written over 2 centuries ago by the author named Alexander Fraser Tytler. And he was writing about the democracy in ancient Athens and why that democracy failed. And this was his understanding of why democracies. You know, the problem is with every government is that humans are involved. And we tend to mess things up. And well, anyway, we'll move on. I'll stop talking politics here, unless someone wants to, I mean, I'm praying for my country. Don't misunderstand me. But unless we turn back to the Lord, I don't have a lot of hope for us. So let's go to verse 44. In the days of those kings. Okay. Which kings is he talking about here? Would you say? Everyone's so quiet tonight. It's nice, but I'm glad to hear you talk too.
The divided empire.
The divided empire?
So.
Maybe. You know, he's been talking, in the days of those kings, if he's talking about the kings of Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Greeks, the Romans, if you say, in the days of the kings of Britain, such and such happened, you're not specifying exactly when it happened. You just say it was in the days when those kings were ruling. So that again raises the question here, which kings are we talking about? And it says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. So you have this, the most important kingdom here mentioned is the fifth kingdom, the stone that smashes the statue. Now, some would say, in the days of those kings, if you compare this chapter 2 with chapter 7, then you have the mention of I think you've got the chart there in front of you that I handed out. You've got, what is it, 10, not 10 toes, but
10 horns.
10 horns, yeah. And so that represents 10 kings in the future. And so the 10 toes represents, it's parallel to the 10 horns, maybe. But if you take that view, then the kings that we're talking about are the kings that are still in the future. So I'm trying to explain here, maybe I'm not doing the best job of it, but why it is that some would say the rock was Jesus in his first coming. You may say, well, he didn't destroy all these empires. Well, in a sense, spiritually, you could say he did, because he overcame by his work on the cross. And we are more than conquerors, Paul says about us. That's kind of this, if we're taking spiritually. Others would say, no, that's not what we have here. What we have here is this: when Jesus returns in the second coming, then the kingdoms of this world will be ending. Well, that's true, but keep in mind that the stone becomes a mountain. That suggests there's a period of time involved. And so this is part of what's difficult in interpreting about the fifth kingdom and the fourth kingdom, about whether it has to do with Christ's first coming or his second coming. Now, I kind of take the view that it refers to both. So I think that our Lord in his first coming won the victory. Death has been defeated. But we still have not, we have fulfillment, but it's not completed yet. And it will not be completed until the second coming. Now, some of those who would argue that, let me give you some of the reasons people will say that this has already occurred, or it's not occurred yet. We'll go with that. So it's revealed that the kingdom will be established in the days of those kings. So again, the question is, which kings are we talking about here? If you look just at chapter 2, in context, it's the kings that are, Babylonia, Medo-Persia, Greek, Roman. But if you connect it with chapter 7, some would say, no. In chapter 7, you have these 10 horns, and they're kings in the future. So it's those kings. Okay, so you have to decide which is the best reasoning there. And then some would say, again, I've already talked about the crushing, but this also says that this is going to occur in the end times. Does someone see which verse that is? I need to look for it here. This is going to occur in the end times. Daniel 2:28. God reveals to Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. So some would say, well, obviously, The latter days are referring to the future at the second coming of Christ. However, if you go back and look in the New Testament, it indicates we're already in the latter days. And let me give you some verses to consider on this. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 and 8 says, the end of all things is near. The end of all things is near. Acts 2, verse 15 and 7 through 17, Peter says, for these men are not drunk as you suppose, for it is only the third hour of the day. But this is what was spoken of through the prophet Joel. And it shall be in the last days, I will pour forth of my spirit on all mankind. So according to that verse, we're already in the last days. And then Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days, has spoken to us in his Son. So it seems like we're already in the last days. But some would say, well, this is talking about in the last days when these 10 kings appear in the future. And that's the way they would respond. So, again, it's kind of, if this was easy to figure out, all the biblical scholars, I think, would generally be in agreement. So, now before we move on, question or comment about that?
Well, this rock that struck the statue and destroyed it, and it became a mountain that filled the whole earth.
Yeah.
Well, if that rock was Jesus, then I would say that it has not yet filled the whole earth. Because it says that it will lead to a time when this government will destroy all these other governments and will last forever. But I don't think we're at that point yet.
No. So that makes me think the second coming isn't quite as close. Now, it'd be delighted if it happened before we leave tonight, But yeah, that makes me think that, and there's other reasons I would say that the second coming may not take place right away. It could. And I think the emphasis of the scriptures is to be ready for it.
Well, no doubt, with the second coming, then the whole earth, that rock will fill the whole earth.
Yeah.
That mountain will. But until that time, I think there's still some other rocks around.
Yeah, but the rock is getting larger. There's more people who proclaim the name of Christ in this world than any other religious group. Now, I don't know that all of them are Christians, but you can look that up, and that's correct. Still, of course, there's much persecution going on, and we see that indicated in the book of Revelation. That will be the case. Okay. Some would say that the one reason to say that this is still in the future is that the kingdom of God will be of divine origin. So that's referring to when Jesus returns to earth in his second coming. But certainly the spiritual kingdom of God is of divine origin. And I believe Jesus is reigning from heaven now. Third, some would say the kingdom will be eternal. And so that's why it's going to refer to the kingdom of the future. But I think the kingdom our Lord instituted at his first coming is eternal. And in fact, I would ask the question of those who would say that it's referring to the millennial reign of Christ. Remember now, the millennial reign of Christ only lasts 1,000 years. Now you could say, well, it's still eternal because Christ is king. Yeah, but his spiritual kingdom is eternal. So, it's not so much I'm trying to convince you of one view or another. I'm just trying to sort through this thing through it.
What does the Aramaic, how does it define the rock and the mountain? Is it literal or is it a metaphor?
Well, I think it's a metaphor because we're not talking about a literal rock that's coming in the future. But the word rock here is the common word for rock that was used. Now it's in Aramaic, but Aramaic and Hebrew are very similar. I think it's the word pronounced something like Evan. If you've heard of the name Ebenezer, I think that means rock of help. And so the rock becomes a mountain. I hope that I haven't done any much study on that word mountain to see what it means. I just assume it means,
Big rock.
yeah. Yeah. So, some would say that these other four kingdoms are earthly. So this must be an earthly kingdom that's being spoken about. Well, keep in mind that the Jews in the first century were expecting an earthly kingdom. And I think Jesus instituted something far greater, a spiritual kingdom, by his work on the cross. And so, some would say verse 44 most naturally would be understood to speak of Christ's second coming. So we could look at that again. Verse 44. Pardon me, I've got to turn my page here. Someone have it, they can read it for us.
Verse 44.
Yeah.
In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed.
Yeah. So some would say that naturally you would think that's Christ's second coming. Well, if you're persuaded that's Christ's second coming, that's what you're going to think. Now, by the way, some of the professors and I at the seminary college where I teach hold different views about this. And to me, this is really valuable because when we're in class together with the students, it helps them to be able to raise questions and think through this. There are certain things I think we absolutely have to agree on, like God is a Trinity. If you deny that, I need to talk with you. That's heresy if you deny the Trinity. But coming to some conclusions about some of the book of Daniel and how the interpretations work out, biblical scholars, we don't have well, some people think they have it all figured out, but I don't think anybody has it all figured out. We're still working to figure some of this out. So,
in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, are you saying they're the same? I mean, if you believe that it's happened, or if you believe it's in the future, people hold that's the same dream, the same scenario?
yeah, well, it's a different dream, but it's revealing some of the same truth.
Okay, so there's nobody that thinks that was one period and this is another just because of the difference in the toes and the horns and all like that?
Yeah, those who believe in the authority of scriptures would affirm that, there's the parallel there. Where the difference of opinion comes in is whether or not the 10 toes in the statue represent the 10 horns. And so, exactly what are we to conclude? Or the 10, again, does the statue have 10 toes because it's a human statue? Or is that representative of the 10 horns? And it's not entirely clear. You kind of have to speculate and guess a little bit here to say that it is. And the critics, those who say it is may be correct, but it's not clear that part is the same. Okay, so some would, and by the way, some of these arguments I'm sharing with you or from one of my professors at the seminary, who's written a book on the book of Daniel. And when I teach on the book of Daniel, I use his book, even though I don't always agree with it. Because I think it's a terrific book. I think he's done an excellent job. Okay, so Daniel says of the fourth beast, Daniel 7, verses 7 and 8. I want to jump ahead for just a moment, because some would say, you know, you've got the two parallels here. And it talks about the fourth beast in chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast. Now, I do think that portion of the fourth beast is a reference to something that's going to happen in the future. Again, not all the scholars are in agreement about that, and we'll look more at that when we get to Daniel chapter 7. But it's not necessary to conclude that the 10 toes are the 10 horns. That's, you know, that may be accurate, but it's not necessary to conclude that. Also, my fellow professor at the seminary says, Christ's coming will be triumphant. That's how we know that this is the second coming. Wasn't his first coming, triumphant? You may say, well, he died on the cross. Yeah, but he rose from the grave and defeated death and defeated Satan. So there's various views about this. And then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many gifts in verse 48, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon.
Can we go
chief,
back to,
yeah.
Can we go back to 7:7?
Which verse again?
You read 7 and 8, right?
Yeah, in chapter 7.
In chapter 7.
Yeah.
And so MacArthur comments on verse 7, talks about the Roman Empire coming back together before Christ's second coming, and the 10 being reunited even though they've been separated previously, and then the 11th being the Antichrist. Well, that would answer the question to the period that we just discussed before, so that it would all be prior to the second coming.
And that's very possible. That's very possible. I believe that those passages do refer to kings who are going to be existing in the future in chapter 7. What's not clear to me is whether the rock here that's mentioned has nothing to do with the first coming of Christ. I think it does. Again, I tend to go with both and. So there's the one view that says it was the first coming, not the second coming. I think MacArthur goes more for the view it's the second coming, but I go with the view that it's kind of both. Yeah. So, yeah, we have some differing opinions about some of these things, and it's not easy. I appreciate you sharing that. It's not easy to figure some of this out.
Yeah, it's not always that you bring the master's seminary into the session, like having John as MacArthur as the third person in the room.
Well, if you've been to Rodney's Sunday school class, he is quoting from MacArthur continually, you know. And it's fine with me. I think I have a great deal of respect for MacArthur. I don't agree with him with everything. And I think I've told you before, don't toss me out of the church, but there's something that Paul said I'm not so sure about either. And you probably heard this, but he said he was the chief of sinners. I think I'm the chief of sinners. Okay? But okay, Paul, if you insist, you're apostle, I'll let you go. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I like MacArthur. I've used his books extensively, and I appreciate him very much.
His material is easy to access. It's free.
That's one of the things I like about him.
Yeah, so, yeah.
I like Sproul better, but I have to pay for some of his.
Yeah, he's very good too. He's very good. There's some fine scholars out there. So, another question, comment? Hopefully I've helped you as you thought through this. We may come to some different conclusions, and that's fine with me. I'm not, if I get to heaven and finally get straightened out, that'd be fine. If you get to heaven and you get straightened out, that'd be fine to me too,
If we all had the same opinion about this, then we'd all be robots. We wouldn't have freedom to choose.
That's a good point. All right, any other comments, questions before we close? All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, I'm thankful that though there may be some differing opinions about how some of this prophecy is fulfilled, we know that you gave this prophecy, you gave Daniel the correct understanding of the dream, and you gave a prophecy that is absolutely correct, even if we don't fully understand it. And we are so thankful for your love for us, and that you reveal the truth to us and help us to hunger to even know your truth. Not that we'll ever be perfect in this world, but we can come to a better understanding as we study your word. May you bless all of us as we seek to serve you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.